Cool. So, good morning, Thessaloniki. Thank you for having me. Yes, I am from Australia. I do travel way too much, but when the opportunity came up to come and visit your lovely part of the world, I couldn't say no. So, for those of you who don't know me, I am on Twitter at ShiftKey, so if you want to follow along and heckle me over there, that's absolutely fine. If you have questions about Git or GitHub, I will be at the booth later today, but I'm not going to talk about those. I am going to press start. I'm going to talk about a passion of mine, which is working in open source. If I seem very animated or furious during this talk, it's just because I kind of really care. And so I'm going to talk about my work in maintaining open source projects and the things that I've learned and the things that I've gone through as well. I kind of want to hit three key points as part of this talk. Why you would get into doing open source maintenance, the qualities and skills of a good maintainer, and also some of the harder stuff that comes up over time. So, small confession, I was kind of struggling with the intro to this right up until I got into Thessaloniki on Tuesday. And I went to the user group and I saw Soledad Penades talking about knowing the tools that you use. And buried in the talk was this lovely point, because she publishes some modules up on NPM, and she said, you shouldn't feel compelled to support the stuff that you're doing in your side projects. And of course, I'm as part of this, but I do acknowledge that point, and I do absolutely agree with it. But I believe there's a whole bunch of benefits to doing open source in a collaborative way. So I'm going to share some of my stuff that I've done in the past. The first thing, back in 2012, I teamed up with a couple of Australians, Paul Jenkins and Andrew Tobin, for this little thing called Code 52. And it was this simple idea. A new open source, let me try again. A new open source project every week. Now, that kind of seems simple, right? No, it was utter madness. It was amazing madness, but it was very crazy. So what we did was we would start each week with a little project. We'd spin up the repository and kind of get going, and then other people would jump in and help us out. So the goal with Code 52 was to have just the space for people to kind of get started in open source, and as a way to kind of just learn the ropes and hopefully build something that they're interested in. The downsides to this was we were doing it every single week. Start something new, start something new, start something new. Yeah, it was absolutely crazy, but we did it for about 4 months before we decided to just quietly put things aside. I love that experience. I'll keep coming back to how I would do it differently the next time, but I've moved on to other things. So that was 2012. I switched jobs later in the year. I found myself at GitHub, and one of our projects inside GitHub was GitHub Windows, now GitHub Desktop. And so as part of that, we have some stuff that interacts with the GitHub API called OctoKit. So I found myself helping publish that out as an open source project, and then helping support the community around it. Because we figure if it was good enough for us to build stuff using the GitHub API, other people might be interested in it. So at this point, we have received contributions from 113. Again, the cool thing about this project is that it was fairly specific. We kind of structured things in a way that made it easy to contribute, and we worked on it at our own pace. We'd add the stuff in that we'd need, and if other people wanted to add in stuff, they could do it as well. It was a very laid-back environment for us to just basically build this little thing out. So what was interesting about those 113 contributors is that about 35% of them had 10 or more commits in the repository, which means that they were hanging around for a period of time. There were some other interesting stats there, 100 and something people watching the repository, 400 and something people forking it. I don't like the stars metric for tracking stuff because it's a very passive way to interact, but the other metrics there, you know, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. The thing that I loved about this project is that it inspired someone else to go and steal our code to then go and do it somewhere else. You know, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, that sort of thing. Yeah, so those are the sort of projects I've been working on, helping people get into open source and basically creating spaces for people to participate. So coming back to Soledad's point around not being compelled to do that, I'm going to try and explain the opposite point using my totally non-scientific method that I've called the trajectory of collaboration. So here's my non-scientific graph. It's not even to scale, it's not even labeled. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to describe roughly on the x-axis, the work involved with kind of pushing your project forward, and then on the other side, the results or outcomes. So let's set some baselines. World domination is probably a bit ambitious, but let's shoot for the stars on this. Down the bottom is like the very simplest thing that could happen. I publish up something I think is cool, and then someone else finds it. Like literally no work involved with that, but ultimately if someone else gets a kick out of that, then that's cool. So let's say someone finds my project. The next step there is they go off and use that code in their project. I might not know about it, but ultimately that's the first step on this journey. Someone's gone, oh, this thing is cool, let's go and try and use it for something that I've got, or some problem that I've got. So let's say time goes on, the other person is reasonably happy, they come back and they submit a fix. We have a whole bunch of tools these days, whether it's package managers or things like GitHub for collaborating on stuff. So a lot of the friction with this stuff is trivial these days compared to a few years ago where we'd have to do things like mailing lists and submitting patches by manually. But this point here is rather interesting. So this person here has found a bug in my code. It could be something that I wasn't aware of. It could be something that I don't care about. But the whole point here is that they were passionate enough to kind of jump back and say, hey, I've got this improvement. So you imagine like over time that I take in fixes, I then publish out new stuff, iterating on the work that's already there. Other people come in and do the same. So things start moving in a certain direction. The next step is something a bit more radical. So let's say someone else wants to go and take my project in a new direction. They could go off and fork it, which is very easy to do on GitHub, but they also might propose adding this feature back into my project. Me, as like the person who owns this code, I could say, I don't really know what this thing is for. I'm just going to not take it in, which is absolutely fine. I have specific goals with my stuff. But maybe our things overlap. The nice thing about all this stuff happening in the public is that other people could jump in and say, yes, this is cool, yes, this is cool. There are ways to gauge demand and interest in these sorts of features. But the thing here is that someone else is, again, investing more time in my project and wanting to build on top of stuff that I've already done. So we could have that process happen. Oops, switched off. So we could have the adding of features over and over and over, the project evolves, the project gets bigger, until you wake up one day and the community itself is essentially self-sustaining. You have people reviewing fixes, people proposing features, people helping answer questions. Like, this is the path that the project should go on, to the point where eventually my participation doesn't really matter. I don't need to be at the center of this universe. We're kind of moving down this path of this thing growing up into being a real boy. And so further down the path, the evolution continues, the community gets bigger. There's this little wondrous point where the community will start going and doing stuff without you. This might be a bit sad for those people, but ultimately for those people who started the project. But at some point, things change over time, and everyone, ultimately, those with initiative, will just keep pushing the thing along. So to summarize all of this stuff here, I believe open source is a human endeavour in the end. Lots of people have this school of thought that code is the only interesting part of open source, whereas for me, I've never really seen the code as the most important stuff. The code is the output, but also the people that I've met doing open source stuff over the years. I have lifelong friendships, opportunities to travel, all that sort of stuff, and it makes me sad that people take this stuff for granted, because ultimately, when I am doing stuff, submitting issues, submitting pull requests, that sort of stuff, there is a person on the other side, and so we don't get that stuff because of basically we're all behind keyboards. So I want to talk about a couple of books that influenced me in particular around my thoughts and philosophies. So the first one is The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric S. Raymond. Has anyone read this book? No? Oh, maybe one, maybe two. Cool. So this book here is about the philosophies of open source projects and how they run. So he contrasts things that are done in a very formal way, the cathedral model, like things like GCC and Emacs is the other project that he uses, versus the sort of more flat model of projects, things like Linux kernel, and he has Fastmail, I think was Eric's project. Anyway, so he goes through a whole bunch of lessons that he's learned over the years. The book is nice to read, but it was kind of written in the late 90s, and compared to now, it's a little bit dated. So the thing I loved from Cathedral and Bazaar was every good open source project starts from a personal itch, and I absolutely agree with this. The stuff that I've done that has lasted the longest has been from some sort of problem that I've needed to fix. Because simply, like, I go and write some code, I define what I need to fix up, at the end I have something that works, and ultimately I've fixed a real problem that I've had. That sort of stuff is a great way to kind of just get started with open source, even if you never show it with the world. Thinking that way is good. The other book that I really like is Social Architecture by Peter Hitchens. Let me get that right. Cool. So he's started the ZeroMQ project, which is a messaging protocol project, and he actually did a whole bunch of research behind the scenes and used his project as an experiment for proving his theories. And the opening of the book actually quotes James Surowiecki around the wisdom of crowds. So there is a kind of a psychology theory that the wisdom of crowds versus the group of clever individuals, the wisdom of crowds is actually far superior in certain scenarios. And so a whole bunch of Hitchens' work around open source communities has been challenging this assumption that the smartest people are the ones that will generate the best outcomes. Anyway, I'll come back to these books, and I will send out a bunch of links after the talk. So let's say all the stuff I've set up to this point is not crazy, and you kind of want to get into your own stuff. What's next? So let's say you've found a certain sort of itch that you need to scratch, and you decide, all right, I'm going to go build something out. Setting the vision for what you're doing, I think, is really, really key to whether a project succeeds or not. The vision should be very narrow, and so that other people can jump on and follow along with what you're doing. Because if it's very broad or vague, you might end up with something different. So in terms of like the general day-to-day stuff that happens when you're kind of starting out this project, let's say you've built out some code to fix a problem and you've published it up. Generally, you'll see this sort of stuff as the day-to-day work that you do, you know, reviewing issues, looking at contributions, that sort of stuff. And what's interesting here is that none of this is really related to code. The transition from engineer to manager is lots of people don't like it in our industry. So open source is also kind of in that vein, and you might be really sad about that. But I've found as my projects go along and more people get involved, it's more better use of my time to be facilitating. And so manager, facilitator, whatever you want to call the terminology, the output that I can get of many people versus the output of mine is just, you know, orders of magnitude. So I'm okay with doing less code as these projects get bigger, but just something to look for. And that was the slide I was going to talk about. So emphasizing stuff that is not code is very important to projects. The difference between a good project and a great project is kind of plain to see at times. So React, I gather you guys have heard of React JavaScript framework. This is their README. You know, it's a nice little introduction to everything. They have a very nice website. This is the sort of stuff that really good projects have because it makes it a whole bunch more approachable, which leads into my next point. Sorry. Cool. Thank you. Sorry. So having good resources and having ways to make it easy for people to dive into your project is a really fantastic way to help things grow. As the person who starts the project, it's often easy to get bogged down in all your details because you know where everything is. You need to kind of step back from time to time and say, all right, if I'm starting new on this project, what am I doing? Like, and then knowing where the problems are then makes it easy for people to kind of jump in. So some shameless self-promotion. I have a side project that I started with someone a while ago called Up for Grabs. So this is a place that open source maintainers can submit issues that are approachable for new contributors. So they give me a PR with some details for their site. I go and review it and publish it up. And so this is then a place that people who want to get started with open source can go and browse relevant projects. A related one, but this isn't mine, is a little site called Your First PR. Kind of similar to Up for Grabs, but they have a more opinionated way of doing things. So you have an issue that is very well defined, almost down to the point of it being implemented. You have the issue is only available to people who've never contributed open source before, and you have a maintainer who's willing to see it through to success. So the example that I've got here is something from the Up for Grabs project. So someone was asking, hey, I want to get involved, but I'm not sure where to start. I've gone through all the steps here to kind of describe it, literally stepping through the process. The sad thing here is that someone else came in and submitted the PR, but ultimately it was written up really well and really approachable for people who aren't sure where to start. So the other things that maintainers should do is be very mindful with their words. All of the stuff that we do these days in open source is text-based, whether it's email, GitHub, Slack, all that sort of stuff. It's very easy to turn a sensitive situation into I was almost going to swear, a disaster, let's put it that way. So I recommend being very thoughtful with your written conversations. I am here in Greece where your English is very nice, thank you for that. But not everyone has a background in strong English. So if you are writing things out, try and be as simple as possible with the words that you use. I definitely get caught up on this because I will use Australian idioms and Australian slang from time to time, and I just have to kind of remember the audience that I'm using. But if you are writing stuff that is very sensitive or controversial or challenging, don't be afraid to take your time. If you're writing out a lengthy reply, put it aside, go get some air, come back. Do you still feel the same way about the written post? If so, cool, publish it up. Good open source maintainers do make mistakes, and they should be upfront about it. So on top of my open source projects, I also maintain the gitignore repository at GitHub. For those of you who haven't seen this, it's a whole bunch of templates around various sorts of programming languages, tools, and operating systems. And so when you go file new repository on GitHub, we pull some stuff out from this list. So a PR came in last year, adding some stuff to the Visual Studio template, and I went back and forth with the person. I couldn't see anything wrong with it. It was around Application Insights, which is a metrics tool on Windows Azure. So I'm like, yeah, there's some sensitive stuff in this file. It should be, reasonably easy to ignore. Yeah, let's merge it in. 2 weeks later, someone else comes back and tells me that, I kind of broke all of the deployments on Windows Azure. Yeah, that was not a good day for me. So it turns out that the config file wasn't actually sensitive, and there was nowhere in the docs for us to kind of understand that, so we went with the conservative approach, which was, it broke the world. So I'm going to just wrap up the section with some extra kudos from the other sorts of material that I've read in the past. So open source maintainers should release stuff early and often because it's a great way to have a feedback loop. And of course, as users are kind of running the latest stuff, they're more likely to give you feedback that is relevant. There is a trend in open source for treating users with contempt and or disdain. It makes me sad that it's very combative in nature, but ultimately empowering your users and trusting them with how you work it becomes a great source of input for your project. Little things that I have here, making updating your project easy and hassle-free, making it easy to debug so that users can produce better quality bug reports. When they have ideas or feedback, actually use them. Don't say, oh, yeah, thanks for that, and close. Like, actually consider their stuff, because they are using your work. So they might actually have ideas that you haven't thought of before. From the social architecture side, transparency. As I messed up before with the gitignore project that broke Windows Azure, I was basically, I was straight up. Like, I just said, yep, I messed up. Being honest about stuff when it happens, yes, it does make us look more human, but ultimately, this is a human endeavour. So why not do that stuff? As long as you're not making the same mistakes twice, yeah, it's fine. little other things that I've got here is I will often reject pull requests for stuff that just isn't quite right. Always make sure to leave a comment at the end saying this is why I can't take it. Yeah, again, being transparent and being honest with people, I think, is very important to the whole thing. And the other one that open source projects do a lot is they talk trash. React versus Angular versus Ember versus, what were the old ones? Backbone, yes. So these projects will, not necessarily the project maintainers themselves, but the communities do get aggro at each other. And I see open source as not being a zero-sum game. It's people working together with different visions, quite often competing visions, but it's not necessary to beat one down and in order to lift yourself up. All right, so we've gone through some stuff, some thoughts. Let's talk about the downsides. So, as the creator and maintainer of a project, the buck quite often stops with you. It's kind of sad. The fun stuff with this is that there will often be just stuff that you need to do, and people will bug you, whether it's through email or Twitter or stuff. Like, they will come to you with their problems, no matter what. Over time, the stuff can weigh you down, the situations change, which means you might not be as invested in the project. The situation that I love was a blog post from Felix Geisendorfer back in 2013. So the idea to kind of spread yourself out and quickly grow projects out is to give a good contributor commit rights immediately. If they've done a good pull request, just give them the keys immediately. This terrifies people when I tell them about it. But the thing is, okay, so someone has submitted a pull request. They care enough to come back to the project. If the pull request is good enough to be merged, why not the next one, or the next one, or the next one? Undoing changes and undoing pull requests is trivial. On GitHub, you click a button to revert and you can do that stuff there. The trepidation with taking in new code, I believe, is very overrated. On the ZeroMQ project, they do a lot of merging of stuff that is rough quality, incomplete. Basically, as they want like no barrier to getting stuff in, and so they will work with the people to do it, but it's always a default for like, let's get this in. And the novelty of giving people the commit bit is that it's a simple thing, but it's really empowering to people. It's my way of saying, hey, I trust you, I'm still around, but here's the keys to the car. Of course, unlike a car, you can't really trash a project that easily. But of course, times change and priorities change, and little things that come up quite often mean that it's no longer as important to you to keep this project going. So knowing when to hand over the reins to someone else, I think, is really important. If you don't do this, projects will atrophy, nothing happens. I'm trying to get a new project, I'm trying to get an old project revived right now, and I'm fighting lawyers and things like that. It's not great. But I have a better story. So let's say 2011, I found myself looking after a project called marapps.metro. So this is a UI library for WPF applications on Windows, open source. There wasn't that much out there in terms of other frameworks, and so we started up this thing. The problem was that when I inherited this, I was no longer doing anything with WPF. And so I was kind of like, I didn't really know what the situation was with the project, what was going on, just all these sorts of things. So I took some time out. I had a look at the activity on the project, because things were going on. And I found 3 people were in particular taking time to do code reviews. And so like that, the famous pull request hack, I shot them off an email saying, hey guys, thanks for keeping things going while I've been away. I'm giving you the keys to the car. Go forth and be awesome. I'm around if you need anything, but I'm just... So I actually said in here that I was going to try and find my way back. I never did. But I look after the build infrastructure now for this project, and Jan in particular heads up this stuff, and that was 3 years ago, sort of thing that happened. So I'm glad that these guys took it and ran with it. I hope it was because I gave them, a bit of faith, but ultimately, who's to know? So other open source projects will, I don't know if you saw this, it was called unmaintained.tech. a little website that you can embed a badge in to say that, hey, this project is no longer being maintained. I find it kind of sad that this thing here is easy to do, but ultimately I understand when you're at your wit's end just to say, hey, go away. Yeah, there are ways to kind of gracefully degrade projects, and this is definitely one of them. So probably the worst thing about doing open source or any sort of human based activity is conflict comes up. People have different priorities, people have different goals, people will disagree with stuff, and this is where the shit part of being a maintainer kicks in. So coming back to the Git Ignore project, someone submitted a Bower template. That was last year. It kind of sat there for a while. I've been doing a terrible job at getting in new templates because it's hard to tell priority. Someone came in a few weeks later and got very, very angry at me. So what was fun here was that he accused GitHub of conspiring to make the Bower community inferior or something. It was just me being absent and not really understanding the situation. So what was fun about this was I took some time out to write a more... That's the one. Cool. So I took some time out to write what I thought was a thoughtful reply, explaining my thoughts on the situation and trying to make things clear. It did not go down well. They got more and more angry at me, and ultimately we came to like an agree to disagree situation, and we went our separate ways. I have said that I will take in this thing based on certain situations, but the thing hasn't moved. Yeah, there are some times you just kind of need to bail out of a situation rather than make it worse, and this was definitely one of them. The fun thing about maintenance of any sort of thing is that it's an ongoing process. Maintaining cars, maintaining hardware, maintaining projects is all the same. And there's lots of stuff being written recently around the struggles with this. So this is a post from Nick Qualanto, where he struggles to balance the love of open source with the work required to do open source. I'll post up these links after the talk. I love this post because he goes into one of his techniques that he talks about, which came from another maintainer, Steve Klabnik. He talks about choosing things that minimize work and maximize results. That might sound a bit cheesy. We got 5 minutes? Cool. I will... Really, 5 minutes? 10. Okay. So go read this post. He talks about choosing things that maximize the value for the overall project versus the selfish stuff. So the very worst thing that I've seen with open source maintainers and software developers in general is what we call burnout. There's a lovely process. I'm being told to hurry up, so I will go quicker. So last year I had a friend tell me over a quiet drink, you seem burned out since I first met you. That caught me off guard. It made me feel terrible, and it made me kind of reflect on the stuff that led up to this point and him intervening, essentially. I found a blog post from John O'Bacon about the steps to burnout, and so I'm just going to walk through them now in terms of my experiences, and I'll let you guys colour that. So, first point, I got 5 minutes. I've got 10. Cool, I'm all right. So the first step down this journey is landing in a situation where you think you should be doing more, whether it's something like imposter syndrome or landing in a team that you don't feel like you quite fit in on. There is that impulse to kind of do more. Then the next step is you actually go do more. You take shorter lunches, you work weekends, you work nights, that sort of going down the hill towards what we later see as burnout. Then we go and sacrifice stuff that we don't see as important. Eating, sleeping, socializing, work-life balance. We believe that work becomes like the most important part of ourselves. Then we take that sort of elevated state, and that becomes the new normal. The next step, everything else gets pushed aside compared to work. Number 6, our behaviour changes. We become cynical, intolerant, aggressive, frustrated. Withdrawal, we pull back from everything. We throw ourselves more back into work. Behavioural changes kick in after that. You know, if anyone has ever told you you are not yourself, that's step 8 on this lovely flow. Step 9, depersonalization, believing that you don't have anything to give the world and nothing gives you satisfaction. 10, inner emptiness, replacing or trying to find that stuff in other things, eating, drugs, alcohol, that sort of stuff. Number 11, full-blown depression, feeling that you don't have anything to offer. Number 12, the burnout syndrome, needing medical attention to essentially survive. So in my case, last time I went through this, I ended up basically around about number 10. Very destructive habits, work was not really satisfying me. Thankfully, I was in a situation where I was given a lot of support. So this is over the course of about 6 months last year. I had various people checking up on me on Twitter, checking up, asking if I was okay. A whole bunch of other people just kind of reaching out over the time. If I didn't have this sort of network of people behind the scenes, I probably would have ended up in a very different state. I was glad to kind of have these places where I could just talk candidly about my mental state, and ultimately this helped me kind of turn the corner and find my way out. So basically the very bottom of the barrel is a post from Jesse Noller. So he took about 2 years off from, Jesse works in the Python community, and he has organised conferences, speaking, involved with a lot of community stuff. He went through a full-blown burnout that ended up costing him his marriage. So I definitely recommend coming back and reading this post. It goes through all the stuff that he's lost and all the stuff that he's kind of rebuilding his life around. This was kind of great to kind of remind me that there is more to life than work. So that was kind of a downer. I'm going to wrap this up with some a bit more sort of light situation. So the big thing that kind of keeps me up at night is how do we make open source sustainable? There's various sorts of ways out there that are kind of working. I've not seen a clear one that works kind of across big projects to small projects, but I will, that's the stuff that keeps me up at night. Probably the most famous quote from Cathedral and Bazaar is this one: given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. So this was Eric talking about the Linux project in particular. I'm kind of skeptical of this one because there is a distinction between projects that are heavily used and projects that have a high contributor base. So Linux kernel has thousands of contributors. Things like OpenSSL and Bash do not have thousands of contributors. And so those projects have suffered greatly in the last couple of years with serious security vulnerabilities. And they are used on millions and millions of machines around the world. I don't really trust this rule as much anymore. Yes, it does work when you have lots of contributors. Not every project has lots of contributors. We are still dealing with OpenSSL problems even today. This was from earlier this month. So the end of this little rant is that open source consumers don't contribute as much to important open source infrastructure. There are some green shoots of optimism mixed in upon that. Node.js itself has a foundation backing it, so open source project with an independent board that determines direction and basic governance for the project. I love that this was set up very early on and is very independent. Companies pay to join the foundation, and then that money goes into the project itself. Smaller scale, one of these things is Ruby Together. So Ruby infrastructure, things like Rails, Bundler, all these projects that lots of devs take for granted are largely run with on the work of specific contributors. So they have basically a pot of money which they then give out to projects. Yes. So the last part of this kind of thing and the stuff that I want you to take away from this is how are we kind of getting more people involved in open source? Yes, there is the downside of currently most of it's done by free labour and done out of a labour of love, but I hope over time we kind of take this stuff more seriously and it becomes an actual way to do paid work rather than a little bit of passion. So I have about 5 minutes, even less? Or less? Cool. So chance for a couple of questions before we wrap this up.
Yes. Thanks. And I had one question for you. It would be, like I do maintain project myself, and one thing I kind of struggle with is when somebody submits a PR, and so you review it, it looks very good. It just, there are little things to change.
Yep.
Do you rather do it yourself, or merge and do it yourself, or ask them to fix it? I can't really, because when I ask them to fix it, I feel like I'm asking too much. Like they already submitted a PR and like made the like the step forward to do it, and then you're like, hey, but this and this and this, it's not.
Yeah.
How do you do this?
So there are very varying degrees of options. So one friend who looks after a big project on the .NET side, he will close people's PRs and rewrite them himself. So he's like literally the other extreme to your situation, whereas I will literally try and get the person to wrap things up. So my bar of quality varies based on the project. So like there are some things which are like, I can't ship this out as it is. Let's get this right. Whereas other ones are a little bit more laid back. So things like coding style and things like that, I'm not so strict about. I have tools like GoFormat to kind of just clean things up. So not GoFormat, but equivalent tools on other sides. So I can run that stuff to clean up the code base whenever I want. But in general, like I will err on getting the person to do the wrapping up, because I think that stuff is really useful to get them to be kind of more involved with the project more than like a drive-by.
Cool.
All quiet? No. Oh, we've got one up the back. Wait for the mic. Hi. So I think that magic point comes up when the person who starts the project is no longer necessary. That sounds kind of harsh. No longer critical to the project. So you have a core team of X amount of people. They're able to get the normal stuff done without that sort of the original owner. I think when you're at that point, then the thing is self-sufficient. There's things that are unrelated to this, like access to environments, access to package management tools to kind of publish things out. But those things can be managed by a group of people. And I think like if there are decisions that need the original person, then it's not quite a standalone project, I think. And then you get into things like governance and process and organising things. But I think, yeah, the presence of that original person, whether that's critical or not to the project, is an interesting sustainability point. Sorry, what was that last part? Not as often as I'd like it to be, yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.